Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of the Indoor Environments Division's IAQ Science webinar series. Today we are honored to welcome David Butler, Butler, Madhavan, and George Gray to speak to us on the health risk of indoor exposure to particulate matter, a summary of the National Academies workshop, and also communicating the health risk of indoor exposure to particulate matter challenges and opportunities. Doctors Butler and Madhavan, he will correct his name for you, I am sorry for butchering it, will present the results of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine study that resulted in the report Health Effects of Indoor Exposure to Particulate Matter Workshop Summary. This effort brought together 16 expert academics and practitioners to address the state of the science regarding sources of indoor particulate matter, particulate dynamics and chemistry, indoor exposure levels and characterization, exposure mitigation, identified and emerging health concerns, and indoor particulate matter exposure interventions. Dr. Gray will follow upon this talk, focusing on risk communication to the varied audiences involved in and affected by indoor particulate matter exposures. He will summarize the presentation he made at the workshop, along with those given by William Hallman of Rutgers University and Leanne Kahlor of University of Texas at Austin. He offers insights on the challenges and opportunities for better informing indoor air professionals and those involved in building design, management, and maintenance, and the general public about the health effects of particulates and how to mitigate them indoors. We welcome you to the conference, and we will do questions through the chat and question box at the end of the presentation. So as everyone is speaking, if you have questions, please use those boxes. And at this time, I will hand it over to David Butler. Thank you.
Good afternoon and good morning, good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. Thanks very much for being interested in this work that we're speaking about today. Dr. Madhavan and I will be, as was mentioned, summarizing some highlights from a workshop that we conducted. To start out, both Dr. Madhavan and I are staff members with the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. They are the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, to spell out the full title. And we are an independent organization that was created by the Congress to offer advice to the federal government. So we occupy a rather strange place in the Washington establishment as being created by the government but outside of the government. The workshop that we're speaking about actually had its origins in 2015 when EPA's Indoor Environment Division invited us to convene a meeting to talk about the state of the science on indoor exposure particulate matter and asked us to organize it. We were very fortunate to get just a top-flight team of people to serve as our planning committee for this, headed by some names that I'm confident most of you will find familiar. Bill Nazaroff from Berkeley, Terry Brennan, who's a practitioner in indoor air science, Rich Corsi from University of Texas at Austin, Howard Kippen, a physician and environmental health researcher at Rutgers, and Tina Riipanen, an exposure assessment specialist at the University of Cincinnati. We held this workshop almost 2 years ago now, and at the time had about 60 people attending in person and a number of web participants from all over the world. There were 6 focus areas in the workshop, and we had 3 speakers in each of these areas, people whose work we'll be summarizing this afternoon. And they're really an all-star team of researchers and practitioners on these topics. The 6 areas were sources of indoor particulate matter, particulate dynamics and chemistry, exposure levels and characterization, exposure mitigation, identified and emerging health concerns, and interventions in risk communications. It would be impossible for us to summarize everything that went on in this workshop, and we'll make reference to and later give you a source for downloading a summary of the material that was presented there. That's available in PDF form, the entire book. In addition, and again, we'll give details of this later, all of the talks at this workshop and the discussion sessions were recorded and are posted as YouTube videos. All the slides of our presenters are available also for download. So to start, our first session addressed sources of indoor particulate matter. And since we're talking to an audience of folks who I'm guessing in most cases are well versed in this topic, I'm going to skip what might otherwise be considered introductory material in the slides. I'll mention that in the presentation itself. But for anyone who wants to go back and look at some of the additional detail that was provided, I encourage you to go back to our summary report. So the indoor sources of particulate matter are outdoor sources that enter through HVAC, open doors, leakage in building frames, airborne allergens, microbes, that come both from outdoors and indoors, people, pets, plants, and the like, emissions from food and cooking, emissions from desktop laser printers and 3D printers, wood burning, candles and incense, cleaning activities like dusting and vacuuming, cigarettes and e-cigarettes, gas and electric appliances like ranges and stoves, molds that grow on indoor surfaces, and chemical reactions. Our first presenter, Brett Stevens, addressed indoor exposure to these outdoor items and presented a number of research needs coming out of his summary, starting from the bottom and moving up, really to gain more information on the associations between building characteristics and indoor PM levels. And that has to do with the fact that there is rather significant variability in infiltration of outdoor air indoors. It ranges anywhere from 10 to 100% depending on the age of the building, the HVAC system, the air tightness of the building, and occupant behavior. And it's sort of important to get a handle on the influence of these building characteristics, not just because of the variability, but as was noted, we need to get a better idea of the size distribution of the particles that are coming in, the ultrafine particles, PM 2.5 and PM 10, because there are differential health effects for exposure to these various sizes of particulate matter, and because PM 2.5 in some respects represents a sweet spot for penetration. It penetrates more easily than either the ultrafine particulates or the PM10. And further, once you're exposed to these different sizes of particulate matter, the degree to which they can penetrate the lung varies rather significantly. So inhalation exposures, which is the major pathway, are influenced. So Brett in his presentation talked about what he referred to as the elephant in the room when it comes to understanding indoor exposure to outdoor PM, and that's how often people open windows. He mentioned that while it was something that everybody knew about, that there is actually rather little data on this topic And because it has such a profound influence on how much of the outdoors penetrates indoors, it's a topic that he thought was deserving of more research and how it impacts the air exchange rates. Taking and translating this information from exposure to health effects, Professor Stevens noted that there was a need for more integration between the epidemiologists who are studying health outcome and the exposure scientists who are trying to characterize levels that they're finding. Lynn Hildeman was the next speaker, and she was focused on indoor sources of smoke and allergen. Now, we know that combustion from cooking, from natural gas stoves and ovens, from cigarettes and e-cigarettes are major indoor sources of particulate matter. Cigarettes, she noted, were important even if the emitting source is in another unit, if you're talking about multifamily buildings, because cigarette smoke does penetrate rather easily in some multifamily units. Another thing that Professor Hildeman mentioned was the issue of proximity to sources and how that's rather an important issue. It's one that, again, isn't very well studied. When it came to allergens, she noted the wide range of sizes of allergens, and that means practically that there's a wide range of residence times for those particulates in the air and wide variability in where those allergens are deposited in the lungs. When it came to assessing areas where more study was needed, she noted that rather little is known about the factors affecting emission rates of bacteria and fungi from damp surfaces, and we'll get back to surfaces a little bit later. In particular, how airflow, vibration of surfaces and the type of material influence the rate at which they get resuspended. She also brought up the effect of human activity patterns and noted the differential exposure to allergens for people who have certain behaviors, for example, being the person in the house who dusts or vacuums, or those people who spend more time indoors at home. And research tells us that the very young and the very old who may be vulnerable to health problems for other reasons are also those who may be more exposed. Third person who spoke to that first session was Brandon Bohr, and the reason why I have a picture up rather than words for Brandon was because he has such a compelling presentation when it comes to looking at how you research particle resuspension. And in particular, what you're looking at is a simulated crawling child. So you have, in this circumstance, an infant who is not only more vulnerable to certain health exposures because of an immature immune system, but also is much closer to the sources and causing resuspension of particulate matter as she or he is crawling along the floor. And what you're looking at there is a device which is measuring differential exposures for different types of carpet surfaces. Now, resuspension also occurs from walls, from plopping down on a bed or a sofa. And more generally, Professor Bohr noted what he referred to as the pig pen effect, which is that every person is surrounded by a cloud of particulates. And these are particulates that are being emitted from their clothing as they move around and the like. And this influences exposure in ways that I'll touch on again in just a few minutes. So what we know about resuspension is that the size, the configuration, the composition of particles is important, as well as the nature of material that those particulates might be on because different materials will resuspend at different rates. The second session that the workshop dealt with was particle dynamics and chemistry. So this is getting really into the physics and chemistry of particulates and how those affect exposures. Taking a step back, it's important to remember that the indoor environment has both sources and sinks for particulate matter. Particles are circulating in the air, they're depositing on surfaces, and in some cases they're resuspending. And what we know from the research is that there are orders of magnitude difference in the deposition rates for particles that are circulating in the air, which has a great influence on all of this. That practical knowledge, however, is not very widely reflected in modeling, at least at this point, because a lot of indoor models are assuming there's a uniform mixing of airborne particulates when we know that isn't the case, and that uneven mixing is likely to be affecting exposure. Among the other gaps when it comes to understanding particle size dynamics in indoor concentrations are the characteristics of the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, the dynamics of ventilation, that is the air exchange rate and how that changes over time. The dynamics of the various sinks, not just the wall, the floors, carpeting, and the like, but filter efficiency for filters in the HVAC system. And a final area, and this is an area, by the way, that was also addressed in a subsequent report called Microbiomes of the Built Environment, and if you're interested in that topic, I urge you to look up that report too. But the issue of the hidden spaces in homes, the eaves, the attics, the spaces between walls and the like, which can be major sources and sinks for particulate matter. Glenn Morrison was the second speaker in this session, and he spoke about indoor chemistry and aerosols. Now, there are a number of chemical processes that take place in indoor air, processes like oxidation, photolysis, hydrolysis, and the like, and they profoundly affect the nature and composition of particulate matter that's found. Now, one major chemical process you find within an indoor environment are, well, the set of processes, actually, that are influenced by ozone. Ozone is present naturally in all spaces, but it also has indoor sources. And ozone is highly reactive, and there are a number of chemical elements found in the indoor environment, things like cleaning solvents, scented products, even chemicals that are released from food that can interact with ozone and create chemical processes. So changes in the levels of ozone, in the levels of these sources like solvents, can have a significant effect on the composition of indoor particulate matter. Occupants are also important sources of aerosol chemicals because the skin, either naturally and what gets applied to the skin, contains chemicals that will react with ozone. When it came to summarizing knowledge gaps and research opportunities, Dr. Morrison spoke about the limitations of current models, the fact that they tend to be based in ambient chemistry, and suggested that future models need to better account for issues like surface chemical phenomena, building characteristics, occupancy, and the activities of those occupants. And there is a basic need to identify which of these parameters are going to be most important with respect to indoor chemistry. Our third speaker, Charlie Weschler, spoke about what we know about the chemistry of indoor PM. And he spent a bit of time talking about semi-volatile organic compounds. SVOCs are a major class of indoor pollutant, and they come from things like plasticizers, pesticides, flame retardants, combustion products, and the like. And we know from research and measurements that indoor PM is enriched by man-made organics and also by the chemicals and microbes that are present from occupants. Now, when it comes to the chemistry, the issue that animated a bit of Professor Weschler's talk was the partitioning between gas phase and settled dust of particulates, since this can have a large impact on the composition of indoor PM, and compositional changes in turn affect key physical properties of particulate matter because they determine which chemical reactions will take place. He spoke about how phase state, whether something's in a solid versus a gas, affects chemistry and partitioning, and made some mention of metals, which, while they are a rather small part of the whole PM family, can be quite important when it comes to health issues. Third session that was spoken about was exposure levels and characterization. And the first of our three speakers for that was Barbara Turpin. Building on the last session, Professor Turpin talked about how chemicals and partitioning affect indoor PM concentrations, and particularly how gas particle partitioning changes as particles move about indoors. That's important because, as is noted up on the screen here, outdoor to indoor transport changes the composition of outdoor PM 2.5. Professor Turpin also spoke about oxygenated volatile organic compounds. These are things like methanol and acetone that may be more irritants than anything else, but which can still be important for health exposures. It's an area that hasn't been well studied and for which more information is needed. She also indicated the need for more research on hydroxy radical, that's OH, and nitrate radical, NH3, concentrations in production. These are two radicals that come from primarily from ozone reactions, and they have influence on subsequent chemical reactions. Roy Harrison has done a bit of work on the proximity of roads and how that affects indoor particulate concentrations and the health of occupants. He's also done some work addressing the differences between measurements of personal exposure to particulate matter and those obtained by static indoor monitoring. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, a lot of models presume that there's uniform mixing of the air within an indoor space, when we know intuitively that isn't the case. We know that for gases, that the levels that you measure with static monitors and those that are measured at breathing level, exposure levels, are more or less the same. But because of the pig pen, the cloud effect, researchers find that personal measurements of particulate matter are a lot higher than static measurements in those same spaces. Dr. Harrison highlighted unresolved questions on the differential toxicity of particles from different sources and how there may be differences between the toxicity of particular elements that are derived from indoor sources, like food cooking, resuspended house dust, and those that have their origins in the outdoors. The final talk in this session was one by Gary Adamkiewicz, and he spoke about the socioeconomic determinants of exposure. The socioeconomic factors that are associated with poverty are the same ones that tend to result in higher indoor levels of particulate matter, higher exposure, and higher levels of health problems. And Professor Adamkiewicz mentioned the sort of nesting of how we need to consider households as they relate to the buildings they are in, and buildings as they relate to the neighborhoods they are in, when we're trying to understand how the differing characteristics that are influenced by socioeconomic status might affect exposures and exposure levels. We know that people of lower socioeconomic status, for example, are more likely to smoke. Some are likely to spend more time indoors. We know that the buildings they're in are older, might have older HVAC systems that aren't as well maintained, and that poorer neighborhoods may also be neighborhoods that are situated next to pollution sources like high-density roads and industrial manufacturing. Those are some lessons from the first three sessions. I'll ask Dr. Madhavan to continue from here.
Thank you, David. So this section of the workshop particularly focused on mitigating the exposure risks to indoor particulate matter. We were fortunate to have three really thoughtful leaders to take us through the current efforts in this area. Bill Fisk from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, he addressed the use of filtration to remove airborne particulate matter. Sergey Grinshpan from the University of Cincinnati talked about several methods of controlling viable bioaerosol particles in indoor air. And finally, Brett Singer from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab discussed the challenges of mitigating particulate matter exposure in low socioeconomic households, something that David touched upon in his immediately preceding talk. Bill Fisk emphasized the benefits of filtration, and he noted that filtration can be a very effective mechanism to reduce indoor levels of PM, but the current practices are relatively ineffective, even though the cost of doing better using existing technology is not that prohibitive. So, in fact, Bill Fisk emphasized that the filtration of the incoming outdoor air and recirculated indoor air should be the first approach. It should be the basic approach that should be taken to mitigate individual exposure. He also noted that there are several other techniques that are available, such as ion generators and increasing air movement to enhance particle deposits on indoor surfaces, so forth, and also noting the technologies such as fibrous filters or stretch membranes that are available. He emphasized, or he limited his remarks to fibrous filtration. And for our international participants, there are three systems currently in use in the United States that are used to rate filters. And one of them, which is colloquially known as the MRV, Minimum Efficiency Reporting Value, which is developed by ASHRAE. It rates filters on their minimum efficiency within a set of particle size bins. Another one is a microparticle performance rating, or MPR, which was developed by 3M. It rates performance on removal of particulate matter in the 0.3 to 1 micron range of size. And finally, Home Depot's filter performance rating system is also applied. It's a scale of 1 to 10 and also has a color code to rate filters based on large particle removal and also removal of small particles and also focusing on their capacities. So Bill Fisk emphasized that the filtration still continues to be a very effective mechanism, although the effectiveness of the filtration systems itself vary widely, and he reviewed several studies that supported this point. He also talked about this growing trend to add nanofibers in the filtration industry. So these nanofibers have diameters of less than 0.5 microns as compared to, let's say, diameters of a few microns in the most common filters. And experiments in this area note that these filters, the nanofiber filters, can produce a higher ratio of particle removal efficiency to air pressure drop. And there's, of course, also energy consumption related to the particle removal here as well. Also, as part of his other points, Bill Fisk noted that filtration only has a minor benefit with regard to reducing allergy and asthma outcomes. There's also some evidence of benefits in homes with large sources of allergic particles, but only a fraction of health outcomes were actually improved. He also noted that the great potential from filtration to reduce indoor concentrations also looked at reducing morbidity and mortality associated with outdoor air PM. So the health benefits are predicted to far exceed the costs for those interventions, Fisk noted. Similarly, he also talked about the increase in trends of using natural ventilation in commercial buildings, and that also has the potential to increase exposure to outdoor particles. Sergey Grinshpan, as I mentioned before, focused on controlling viable bioaerosols. And he said that there are two main approaches to mitigating exposure to biological particles, and one of them is filtration. That was the emphasis of the previous talk, but also electrostatic precipitation. And as part of his review of a wide-ranging number of methods, including heat, ultraviolet light, and cold plasma that were used to inactivate these microorganisms, Sergey Grinshpan noted that the efficiency of these methods also varies, and we need better insights relating to these things. He also noted that filtering respirators can reduce exposure to aerosols and are generally effective as air filters themselves. So, however, there's the leakage between the respiration and the user's face and so forth. Another point by Brett Singer focused on mitigation strategies for low socioeconomic households here. And Brett Singer reviewed a number of experiments, and of particular highlight, he talked about an experiment, a set of experiments that were conducted in empty houses located a few meters or 300 meters downwind of Interstate 80 in California, near the Sacramento area, and the combinations of ventilation and filtration methods were all, and the resulting effects were reported in a paper that he discussed, and also. He noted the role of air tightness in low-income households and the role of portable filters in this area, and also some of the recent efforts that involved collaborations with voluntary consensus standards organizations like ASTM that looked at methods to improve the efficiency of cooking methods to capture cooking pollutants. There are also a number of actions that Dr. Singer suggested could be taken, including like closing of the windows to reduce the level of outdoor PM, and also restricting smoking, burning candles and incense sticks, and of course using a range hood and cooking filters and so forth. In the subsequent session leading up to it, and this was something that was widely recognized in the workshop as, okay, we have learned about all the risks and the origins of the particulate matter. So what? What should we do about it now, and what are the known health risks of these particles? And we were fortunate to have three very insightful speakers: Ryan Allen from Simon Fraser University, who discussed the effect of indoor PM on cardiovascular system. David Rich from University of Rochester looked at links between ambient PM and adverse birth outcomes. And finally, Mark Weisskopf from the Harvard School of Public Health looked at the role that particulate matter might play in neurological and psychiatric disorders. And this was a session that created rich discussions and brought everyone up to speed on the ongoing developments and so forth. To give you a summary of what Dr. Ryan Allen focused on, I mean, he looked at, as I mentioned, the exposure and the cardiovascular risk here. And he said that the line between the indoor PM and the outdoor PM is not as distinct as some might think. Said that while there were a number of early efforts focused on assessing the impact of PM on respiratory health, there's been a growing number of studies, at least over the past 2 decades or so, on cardiovascular effects of PM exposure. And there are in highlighting the specific mechanisms, we were brought up to speed on how there were possibly 3 pathways through which the effects might expand. And one mechanism, Alan noted, was an inflammatory response in the lungs to particulate matter inhalation that causes releases of cytokines and other biomolecules into circulatory system. Another mechanism involved the activation of the autonomic nervous system, which of course affects the blood vessels and the heart rate variability and other physiological effects. A third mechanism that was discussed also was the transportation of the smaller particles right into the bloodstream when they interact with blood vessels and various blood cells. So the impacts are enormous, and the discussion of this presentation concluded with the potential global public health burden associated with the PM and also some knowledge gaps. David Rich discussed the impact of PM on potential impact of PM on birth outcomes here, and he reviewed the now classic 1995 study on Beijing birth registry and how it had how the average pollutant concentration over the first, second, and third trimester and over the entire course of the pregnancy had effects on the birth outcomes themselves, specifically through sulfur dioxide and total suspended particulate levels, and creating preterm birth risks. And David Rich also discussed a number of other natural experiments, quote unquote, that looked at one-time events and their impact on exposure. And these one-time events include like large sporting events and industrial facility closures, and there are other government policies that might drop the ambient pollution levels for a defined time period or so forth, so like a community-wide intervention. And he used the example of 2008 Beijing Olympics as a case study to take us through some of the recent studies in that area. Mark Weisskopf from Harvard discussed the effects of air pollutants and PM on neurological and psychiatric disorders, and he really took us through some of the mechanistic insights that some studies have given us, especially studies that looked at the olfactory nerve connections to important centers of the brain that are involved in emotional regulation, and how these particles might actually get straight into the circulation here, or even create damage to the blood-brain barrier. And so Mark Weisskopf showed us some evidence that whichever route the PM take into the brain, it creates an alteration in the neurotransmitter levels and could elevate oxidative stress and inflammation and other related biochemical changes, all of which can, of course, degrade the neurons. And another case of health risk relating to indoor PM was discussed through the Nurses' Health Study, which showed a significant increase in anxiety symptoms in nurses. About 15% of the nurses in the study had elevated anxiety symptoms, and recent analysis in this area suggests that very recent or maybe even daily exposure might affect these anxiety levels and could ultimately have implications in the development of dementia, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's disease. So David and I have taken you through the who, what, and the why of indoor PMs, and the next presentation by Professor George Gray is going to talk about the how of risk communication. And as I transition over to Professor Gray, I just want to briefly summarize some of the discussions that stemmed from the health impact session. In fact, one of the topics of detailed discussion emerged from Laura Cobb from EPA, who asked the panelists to really comment on the scope of indoor PM as a public health issue. And it was pretty clear, at least through the discussions, about the potential big impact on productivity of people themselves, and the potential long-term effect and what it could do to the quality of life for people here. And that's where I think George comes in to talk about communicating the risks of these issues.
There were a number of summary observations from our workshop participants. Since both Dr. Madhavan and I have given you some detail about those, I'm going to run through these slides very quickly. Among the knowledge gaps that were identified, that we've spoken about, were how ventilation and sink dynamics affect exposure, how building characteristics affect exposure, just what indoor particulates are composed of, both the organic molecules and the metals that are found, the surface chemical reactions that might determine the composition of PM, and the determinants from the significance of the cloud of particles that surrounds us all. Among the key messages, the need for more integration between epidemiology and the exposure sciences to get a better handle on the differential toxicity of particles from different sources, and the need from a socioeconomic status perspective for a systems view of exposure and how behavior and particular subpopulations might influence people's exposure to particulates. Among the areas of research that were identified by speakers were the need for more field measurements to better understand levels inside of buildings and various types of buildings and how buildings themselves influence those. The effects of various interventions on exposures, and better relating lowered exposure levels with health benefits. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, there is a publication that is available for free download from the National Academies Press website that summarizes the content of this study. In addition, Dr. Madhavan and I wrote an editorial in the journal Indoor Air on the topic of communicating health effects of indoor exposure to particulate matter. We also produced a couple of infographics for informing more general public audiences called What's in the Indoor Air and the Spanish version, que hay en el área de espacios interiores, which address these topics at a nice general population accessible level. Those infographics are also available as PDFs. And as this page indicates, the web addresses for them are readily available, and should you need help in getting access to this material, please feel free to email us at the Indoor Particulate Matter, indoorpm@nas.edu email box. Thanks very much.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is George Gray, and I'm really happy to have an opportunity to be here with you today and actually to have been part of the workshop that you've just heard described so well. It was informative, it was provocative, and I think that it identified an agenda for things we can do to move forward with the notion of understanding and protecting people against potential risks from indoor particulate matter. The group that I was part of looked at how we communicate this kind of information. And what I'd like to do is thank the group who was part of this. So I was one of the contributors to this session, along with William Hallman from Rutgers University and Leanne Kahlor from the University of Texas at Austin. Unlike the discussion we just had, what I'm going to present to you is sort of an amalgamation of all of our thoughts, and I'm not going to try to identify which ones came from which of us. As you've heard, you can go back and look at the report or even look at the individual presentations to get individualized attribution if you want to. But what I've tried to do is to take all of the thoughts that were brought up in this session and kind of organize them in a way to help us understand a few things. And what I've tried to break these things down into and to organize them into is to these three categories. So what is it that makes communication about particulate matter indoors so difficult? And I'll show you some of the points that each of us raised. The second is we're not doing something totally new. Are there other situations in the indoor environment, in the outdoor environment, with particulate matter or with other pollutants that we can borrow from to learn what might be good ways to communicate and what might be some of the pitfalls to avoid? And then finally, looking forward is thinking about what are things that we need to do more. It's like the information gaps that we just discussed from the rest of the workshop. What are things that perhaps further research, further development, further attention could do to help us better understand what and how to communicate to people about indoor PM? So there are 4 challenges that I'd like to work through in a little bit of detail with you. The first one is a question of audience. Who are we speaking to? The second is, what are our goals? What are we trying to do with the information that we're communicating to people? The third one goes back to something that was a major part of the discussion at the workshops. What is the risk? How big is the risk? What do we know about it? And another challenge is risk perception. What do we know about how people think about and even how people feel about different kinds of risks, and how does indoor air fit into that? So let's start with the audience. So one of the important things that all of you know is that there isn't any, at this point, regulatory authority that anyone has over the air inside of buildings and people's homes. This means that most of what we're looking to do is to somehow inform the general public. And as came through in our discussion, one of the things we have to remember is who that general public is. This is a challenge that David and Guru actually addressed a little bit. You saw their infographics. The question of, we only have, roughly 30% of adults that have a college degree. And that was used in this discussion as kind of a rough proxy for people who have had perhaps an advanced bit of science or mathematics or whatever it would be. That's sort of the underlying science that we use to try to understand indoor PM. Another really important thing about our audience is what is their ability to do something about indoor air? And a really important observation is that about 43% of the people in the United States live in rental housing. And the differences between what you can do as an intervention in rental housing versus owned housing can be significant. Your ability to make structural changes and even the kinds of investments that you might be willing to make. Similarly, about 15% of the population lives in poverty, which is going to influence, again, the ability to take personal interventions in reducing levels of indoor particulate matter. Something else that was brought up is that even when we as scientists and technical people think about a problem, we have particular ways we do it. The world of risk communication has spent a lot of time thinking about what they call people's mental models of risk. And by a mental model, they mean how is it that people, in their mind, think about what this risk is, what causes it, what can be done about it. And it's a mix of kind of what people know about an issue. Sometimes it's things that they don't know, and help us understand what they want to know. Just as a quick aside, one of my favorite examples, it's not an indoor air example, comes from some of the first papers that were done trying to use a mental models approach to understanding risk. They were done by the group in the Engineering and Public Policy group at Carnegie Mellon. And they were interested in questions of the stratospheric ozone hole. So these studies were done in the sort of the early 1990s. And one of the things that they did is go and talk to a cross-section of the public. They would do things like go to jury pools. There were a whole bunch of people who've been called in for jury duty. They're sitting around all day, not doing much, and they're probably willing to talk to some researchers. But, for example, one of the things that I remember very clearly reading this paper and hearing it from the investigators is when you ask people, when you talk about the ozone hole, what are things we could do to reduce it? And, for example, someone at the time said, well, if we'd send the space shuttle up through the same hole every time, we'd stop making so many and such big holes in the ozone layer. Now, the space shuttle had nothing to do with the ozone hole, but people hold models in their heads of how things work. And if you don't understand what people know, what they think they know, it's much harder to design a communications approach that's actually going to get them the information that they want to know and that will give them the clear information that you're trying to communicate to them. So we had quite a discussion around mental models. Another thing that's important to think about while we're thinking about communication is what are we trying to do with communication? And I've got up here, you can see this figure from another report from the National Research Council on National Academies, improving risk communication. And here, what we pulled out in our discussion is that there are different things that you can be trying to achieve with risk communication. Part of it is you're just trying to help people understand information. So you're doing education, and you're giving them the information that they need to take the actions that they believe are important or not act to protect themselves and their friends and their family. Another form of risk communication is about advocacy or persuasion. And here what you're trying to do is actually change what people believe or what they're doing. Their behavior change is a very challenging area of risk communication in public health, but it's often something that we need to do to when the best way to protect oneself or to protect the population is for individuals to make changes in their behavior. So here what we're trying to do is to persuade people to either take or not take some kind of particular action. And then finally, one that is a little less relevant here, but sometimes part of what we're trying to do with risk communication is be able to have everybody on the same page so that we can have discussions about what to do to have the best information for making decisions as a group. It turns out here, one of the things that is important is that understanding who is involved in indoor air issues is important. And we have to be careful that we're not always focusing on the HVAC world, or focusing on the individuals who live in the homes, or focusing on outdoor sources. But in fact, it's a pretty complicated issue when we get down to it, when we're thinking about indoor particulate matter. You've already heard that at the workshop there was quite a bit of discussion about the ultimate health effects, both what they might be, how likely they might be, how much these exposures could increase these risks. People recognize that most of our understanding, and when I say our understanding here, I'm thinking about our quantitative understanding of increased risk of particular outcomes with exposure PM, excuse me, please, is based on outdoor exposure levels. We know and we heard that the concentration in the mix of particulate matter that is found indoors is different than that's been the focus of epidemiologic study outdoors. But why this is important is that really understanding the size of the risk, how much risk is added to people's background lives of risk, is really important in deciding both whether to communicate. What do we have to tell people, or is this something that is, in the grand scheme of things, a small risk? Or if we decide it's large, what do we want to say to them? What do we want them to do? I pulled this out. This is actually, when you see the quotes, this is something that I pulled really directly from someone, where William Hallman had a slide that I thought was a pretty succinct statement that simply alarming people is ethically problematic. So we want to make sure that we know what the risk is in order to know whether and how to communicate it. And following up on, you don't want to simply alarm people, we also want to be able to tell them things that they can do to reduce their risk. The final thing that we spent some time talking about is research that's come out of the world of really cognitive psychology and risk perception that looks at factors that influence the way people feel about risks. And when I talk about feeling about risk, really what you're thinking about is this something that, as an attribute of a particular source of risk, tends to make people more worried about it or less worried about it? So here on this slide, on the left-hand side, I have things that have been found to decrease the perceived risk. So this is not the risk, this is not objective risk. Decreasing the perceived risk, things on the right increase perceived risk. And just for example, with control, when people feel as though they're in control of something that's generating risk, they tend to be less concerned about it. You don't hear much about people who are afraid of driving. Because when they're driving, they feel like they have the wheel in their hands. They have control of the source of that potential risk, some kind of an automobile accident. When you're riding in an airplane, you don't have control over kind of the direction. You don't feel like you have any ability to alter things. You are at the mercy of someone else, and that tends to lead to people having increased perceived risk. Objectively, per vehicle mile traveled, driving is much riskier than flying, and yet flying feels riskier because of that lack of control. So that's just an example to think about. What we're really talking about here is how people feel about a risk, not necessarily what size the risk is. So we know that if people have the ability to choose a risk, they feel much less concerned than if something is imposed upon them. Natural risks, natural and familiar things tend to be associated with just a decreased perception of the risk, where things that are new, that are novel, that might seem like they're unknown, and especially often things that are man-made are seen as being riskier. Some more factors, people tend to be most concerned about risks that could directly affect them. Things that are considered well-known to science tend to decrease people's concerns, where things that are considered uncertain, the science is unfolding, maybe there's a lot of scientific conflict, tend to increase the perception of the risk. Trust is very important, something we could go on and on about, but if people trust an organization that is creating the risk, controlling the risk, or even just the one telling them about the risk, it tends to reduce their concerns, reduce their fears. A lack of trust in those organizations tends to really increase the risk. And it does appear that if something is directly beneficial, people tend to downplay the risk. We all know that when we're driving around and seeing people on their cell phones, right? I think it's got a benefit to have that thing out and in their hand, and the fact that driving with cell phones is thought to lead to somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 additional deaths on the road doesn't seem to bother people. So the reason that all of these things come together to make indoor air difficult is that there are a bunch of attributes of indoor particulate pollution that kind of work against us being able to work against people seeing it as a significant threat. It is invisible. The particulate matter is just too small in general to be something we see. Many of the sources are voluntary. I have this example on the right. Valentine's Day is coming up, right? You know, to some that might look like a romantic scene. To an indoor air quality person, it's a horror show. But when people have benefits, they get benefits from whether it's the sources or the activities that they do that can lead to increased indoor air, it means that they're going to be perhaps less likely to take on board a message that says that has to be changed. And then finally, back to this issue of mental models, we know that people, from the little bit of work that's been done, suggest that people's view of the risk of indoor PM is linked very much to their ability to sort of see it or smell it, and also that they think most of the that pollution is something that's outside their home, and that, for example, if they keep their home well sealed, they keep their windows closed, they can't have air pollution because it can't get in from the outside. There are, however, some factors about risk perception that might help us while we're trying to communicate this to people. One is, as we heard, this is something where children may be at a special risk, potentially because of biological vulnerability, but perhaps even more because of their activity patterns, kind of where they live their lives in relation to different sources of particulate matter within a home. These are also, in many cases, there are opportunities, as we heard, to control indoor PM to a significant extent. This is through a combination of changes in behavior and technologies that can remove particles from the air. Another thing is that people have thought about some of the sources that we're talking about and have some concern about those. And the examples I have here are environmental or secondhand tobacco smoke, outdoor PM are both things that people have heard of as potential health concerns, and those are also part of the source of indoor PM. And then finally, I was able to find just a little bit of evidence that the public does seem to have some awareness of the potential risks of indoor air pollution. This slide is taken from a paper published by Paul Slovic and his colleagues 20 years ago now. It was based on a survey done in Canada. And in this case, they were comparing the views of scientists, of toxicologists, and of the general public to a wide range of risks. And you can see them in this list, from cigarette smoking and motor vehicle accidents down to video display terminals and food irradiation. And they asked people to say whether they believed that these particular sources were a high risk, a moderate risk, a slight risk, almost no risk, or they didn't know. And one of the things you can see, although it looks like on the slide my arrow's a little bit off, with indoor air pollution, first they asked the toxicologists. And here about 80% of the toxicologists said that indoor air pollution was either a slight, moderate, or a high risk. So they saw this as something that was potentially of concern. But the interesting thing is on the next slide, where members of the public, 1,500 members of the public were asked the same question, and you can see there, about 80% of the public said that indoor air quality is a slight, moderate, or a high risk. And in fact, this is one of the ones with the smallest or with a relatively small amount of people who either say they don't know or believe that it's almost no risk. So there is some awareness in the public. That being said, these are absolutely the only data that I could find where anyone has tried to get a handle on what members of the public think about the risks of indoor air. So some other things that are going to make this challenging: understanding and communicating the magnitude of the risk. So we really, this is part of the technical work that has to be done. We have to understand how big the risk is, and we've got to work on ways to help people understand the magnitude of risk. And there's many things we can draw upon. We're going to have to understand the relative contribution of sources, because that's going to influence the things that people can do. Mitigation approaches that require people to change their behavior are some of the hardest things there are to do. People's behavior is ingrained and has many, many things that influence it. We've got an entire department here at our School of Public Health that thinks about behavioral sciences and how you work with people at an individual level to do things that will improve their health. It's a challenge. And then finally, we do also have to think about the fact that there are potentially risk trade-offs. There may be things where we want to change buildings in order to reduce energy use and potentially greenhouse gas emissions, things like tightening up the envelope, the building envelope, that may actually work against us and the things that we want to do for indoor particulate matter. So there it's simply a reminder that we have to keep in mind kind of the bigger systemic challenge that comes with addressing indoor particulate matter. So the next question that came up in several of the presentations and the discussion is, are there things that we can do to borrow from other situations where risk has been communicated to the public in a way that seems to have potentially influenced their behavior? So the next slide reminds us that there are technical ways to help people think about risks that are invisible. And these two, we've got a carbon monoxide detector on the left, a smoke detector on the right. Those are instruments that people have in their homes to help them maintain awareness of risks that are present in the indoor environment, and risks that they may not be able to sense themselves or sense in time to take action. These sorts of technologies can help. One of the things that came out of the discussion of mental models is part of the problem is people right now rely on what may be unreliable cues. So they think in many ways, I don't have an indoor PM problem until I see smoke. And we recognize when you're seeing smoke, just how high the particulate matter concentrations really are. The other thing we discussed at some length was other situations where people have looked at indoor air quality issues and tried to communicate with the public. And in these cases, and in some of these cases, there have actually been evaluations done. So there's an idea of what kind of a communication effort, what kind of a communication intervention might be the ones that are going to be most successful. Now, all of these, none of these are a perfect model for indoor particulate matter, but one example that many of you in the indoor air world are familiar with is radon. Again, this is one where there has been some research on how people think about radon, how they communicate about, how we can communicate about radon. This one is radon is a little different in that it doesn't have, or the sources that generate it don't have a benefit to the person living in a building. So in that way, the communication is a little bit different. And in some ways, it's not as hard because you don't have, you go back to the discussion earlier, people who get genuine personal benefit from the things that may be generating the risks themselves. Secondhand smoke is perhaps another analogous situation. This is something where I think we can all say we've seen real changes in behavior over the last 20 years. These have come from a combination of regulatory interventions with smoking bans in public places, but just changes in the way that people behave around cigarette smoke. This one has some similarities. It is a voluntary activity. Part of what gets people's attention, and part of what's been communicated very strongly about it is that kids may be at risk. It does have different levels in some ways of some of those risk perception factors that are important, such as awareness and concern, or the knowledge of and fear of the outcomes. It's possible that we could use the work that's been done in the developing world with indoor air quality. A lot of this is around particulate exposure. Often it is in things like cooking or lighting, sometimes heating, but it's different because people are doing very different sorts of things. A lot of times it's because of biomass fuels. The levels that are found there are considerably higher than are found in most U.S. situations. And the mitigation options are a little bit different. Often it's changing things like changing a cooking fuel or something like that. Another one that came up was the idea of indoor pesticide use. So this is something where a harmful product is used inside the home, but for a benefit that people feel is worthwhile, protecting themselves or their home against undesired insects. So this is one where there has been an effort about how to communicate how to minimize the risks, recognizing that they'll sort of never go to zero. It's a lot like indoor air quality in that it is a voluntary thing. It is potentially affecting children because of where it's used and how it's used. It does have differences too. It's a man-made risk. It's something that people aren't as familiar with as they are with things like cooking or candles or pets or other sources of indoor particulate matter. So now looking forward, the question is, what are things that we can potentially do? And there, the discussions and the group focused on two things. What are things we need to know better or know more? And then what are things that we can do to make sure we get our risk information out? So one of the first things that was stressed, back to something we discussed very early, is what do we know about our audiences? What do people know about PM risk? What do they want to know? How do they think about it? So this is getting back to perhaps understanding better the mental models of the general public around the risks of particulate matter in their homes. It would help us to perhaps think a little bit about how can we make PM a relevant and compelling topic. And this goes back to those examples I was just talking about. Are there things we can borrow from where we can understand situations where we can communicate with people in a way that would be compelling? And in that case, for some of the different audiences that we want to talk to. An important factor there is who would do the communicating. Different audiences require different sources or give more credibility or have more trust in certain sources. And that goes to the question of how else can we get messages out. So we need to learn about our audience first and foremost. At the end of her talk, Leanne Kahlor from the University of Texas suggested that it might actually be useful to gather some data. And she suggested a rigorous national survey that would look at the general population and then potentially also at at-risk populations and try to understand what they know about indoor PM, what would make them want to seek out more information. Importantly, as I was just saying, what would be a trusted source? Where would they go for that information? And a variety of other factors. And it was argued that if we had these kinds of data, they could tell us things that are really important for designing a communication strategy. So these would be the kind of things that help or hinder the information getting out to audiences. How do people actually perceive these risks? And are they perceived in a way that is going to motivate them to do something or not to do something? How much knowledge people think they need, what kinds of information is out there, and whether they think that it's out there and they can trust it. Where they want to hear about what source they want for the risk information, whether it's from a kind of a more individual interaction with somebody like a doctor versus coming from community health workers versus coming from the Environmental Protection Agency. The final thing that was stressed is that when we're going to communicate, we've got to plan our communication in a very serious way. So we want to think of who is our communicator, what they're going to say, to whom. And one of the things that was stressed in our discussion was that there may be multiple different audiences. We may be talking to the general public. We may be talking to builders of homes and buildings. We may be talking to people who are involved in setting up and running HVAC systems and things like that. The question of what channels might be used, what is the intention? Remember, that goes back to our very early discussion of what are our goals, understanding our goals of our communication, so that we know whether we are trying to change people's attitudes, knowledge, or behavior. And another thing about planning that communication is also having a way to evaluate it at the end, to know how well it worked, what factors might have made it successful, and perhaps what factors made it less successful than we would have liked. So to wrap up the discussion around communication, part of it here is there is no, right now we don't have a direct and easy recipe for deciding what to say. We know that communicating about indoor air pollution and particulate matter in particular requires scientific and technical information. We need to know how big are the risks. What are we telling people about the risks? Not just that they exist, but how big is it? We need to know something about how the public thinks about these risks, their mental models and how they process them in their own lives, and then how they feel about them, how risk perception factors influence the way that they perceive that risk, whether it's one that rises to the top of their concerns or drops to the bottom. I think that information from other sources or situations that are kind of similar may provide some help, some guidance on what works and what doesn't. But there are things that are very specific to questions of indoor air quality. And then finally, it may be that gathering more information, perhaps in the form of the survey that Professor Kahlor recommended or in some other way, can probably help us do a better job of that risk communication. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you all. These were wonderful presentations. We have only a little time left for a few questions, and I would like to make sure everyone is aware that you can submit your questions through the chat box. We will collect them. Many of them we will send to the speakers, or we'll work together in consultation with the speakers to follow up on some of them because we had quite a few questions. But maybe we can get at least one or two answered. I'll hand it over to Erin or Christina.
Hello, everyone. We got a bunch of great questions, so we're going to have a couple minutes to get to a few of them. The first one I'm going to ask, and any of our speakers can answer these. Other than laser printers and copiers, are there other sources of ozone that may be more common in indoor environments?
Well, this is David Butler. One of the sources that we didn't mention were ozone generators that have been sold in some venues as air cleaners, and EPA has information available on those and on the exposure risks that are associated with high indoor ozone levels that can be generated by such devices.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question we got is, what is in the personal cloud of PM? Shed skin cells, dust on clothes, shoes, exhaled water vapor, PM?
That's actually a very good summary of the primary constituents of people's personal clouds. I guess the only thing I might add to that are any bioaerosols that might be generated by people.
Thank you. We have a particular question on messaging. So this is for Dr. Gray in particular. The vast majority of health messaging around indoor PM is focused on asthma and allergies. It does a tremendous disservice as the majority of the population then tunes out the message. Many of those who tune out to our message are, in fact, at risk of cardiovascular, neurologic, and immune effects of indoor PM. As a member of EPA Clean Air Act Advisory Committee, this person is interested in how we can craft better messaging and shift away from outdoor asthma standard messaging. Any thoughts?
That's an excellent observation, and that goes to one of the things that we discussed a fair amount at the workshop, and that is the audiences. there are different audiences. There are groups who may be at greater risk of certain kinds of PM or certain kinds of exposure, and those should be identified. And, in the cases of asthma and things like that, that may be appropriate. But it should also be recognized that there are other audiences that need to, if, as I said, the science says that these risks are big enough and we need to talk about them, we need to make sure that that information is packaged and processed for the more general members of the population, those who may not fall into risk groups, but still are facing an increased risk of concern from that indoor exposure. So that's a really good question. It has to do with really making sure that we recognize that there might be multiple audiences that we want to reach.
Thank you.
Our next question. Sometimes indoor air pollutants are at higher levels than outdoors and vice versa. How can homeowners and businesses know when to ventilate with outdoor air and when to limit outdoor air intrusion? It seems like we need, this speaker thinks things like we need a smart device that will automatically shift between increased and decreased fresh air ventilation. Has there been any research into this?
This is a topic that is getting a lot of discussion at conferences that are associated with indoor air exposure. And the questioner is quite correct that it's a big challenge to understand when and under what circumstances it might be better to draw more indoor air in or to protect yourself from the outdoor air. Technology is improving rapidly in this area, and we are getting to the point where there are some small, portable, reasonably priced devices that are available for monitoring indoor air quality. And my personal impression from talking with professionals in the field is that this is going to be something that's going to expand considerably in the next few years.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. This one's very timely. It says, what are the health risks after a home has flooded? This question comes from someone that was impacted by Hurricane Harvey in Houston. They want to know if there a precautionary measure you would suggest other than investing in good filtration.
Well, this is a topic that was addressed in an earlier National Academies report called Damp Indoor Spaces and Health, which is also available for free download from the National Academies Press website, www.nap.edu. In brief, one needs to be very careful about identifying all identifying damaged materials within buildings that may harbor sources of mold. Some of these are going to be hidden, spaces behind the wall, underneath rugs, and the like. It's important to do a thorough job of evaluating damaged materials, determining whether they can be cleaned or salvaged or whether they need to be replaced, and taking quick action whenever you have any kind of water spill in a home to dry it up as soon as possible.
Thank you. Lorraine, would you like to continue with one more question?
No, I think we're at the end, so I just want to take this time to thank our wonderful presenters. This has been very, very interesting, and we have quite a bit of interest in questions and comments, so I think everybody who participated, I want to thank you. It is our intent to post this presentation on EPA's IED website shortly. Please look for announcements for future IAQ science technical webinars throughout the year. And we really thank you for joining us on this first one. It was a great launch. Thank you.